Hey, everybody. It's me. I am here on a Monday, lagging a little bit, it looks like, but that's okay. I'm going to turn that off. So today we are talking about Mark 2, 23 through 28, that talks about the disciples plucking grain on the Sabbath. And we're going to look at this a little bit. And I'll read the text first, and then we'll jump right in. All right. I'm going to close something over here so it doesn't bother me so much, okay? All right, there we go. One Sabbath, he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need of food? He entered the house of God when Abiathar was high priest and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat. And he gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, 'The Sabbath was made for humankind, not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath.'" All right. So there's a lot of interesting things going on here, and there's some things, you can get real nitpicky about this on some of these terms and this story that Jesus goes back and tells. Many people will say that, if you look back, that there's some inaccuracies about the story, but that's really not the important part. The important part is what's going on here with Jesus, his disciples, and the Pharisees. Now, we've seen that this is another example of a controversy that we've seen more of these throughout chapter 2. the Pharisees asking these questions of Jesus about his disciples and their actions, whether it's about fasting or who they eat with, what now about them plucking grain on the way through the field. And here's where here's what I really want to focus on in this story. What you have to see here is kind of this contestation between who is going to be who's going to have authority to lead the people in this area in Galilee, and as we move on in Mark, in the rest of Jerusalem, and then of course maybe the rest of the world, depending on how you want to look at it. Who is going to have authority? And the Pharisees clearly are trying to police and regulate what's going on with Jesus and his disciples, because they see him as a legitimate threat to their authority and their ability to say how the people should be and to act. And we don't need to get into, we don't need to get into all of the social background of the role of the Pharisees. We've talked about that a little bit before. But I think it's clear here that, this is very similar to, what happens during protests or during marches, when the thing that people are doing is not, you could either let it go, or you could, try to find some way to get people in trouble because of it. And that's what happens here. These Pharisees are just trying to find something to delegitimize Jesus and his followers, and they pick this thing about the picking of grain on the Sabbath, and it's not clear why. It's not clear why they're doing it in, from their side of the story. We get a hint, perhaps, that it has something to do with their need and hunger, because of the story that Jesus tells in response to it. So perhaps they are hungry, and this is a story about their hunger, and that's why they're telling it like they are. Or we don't know for sure. Who knows why that is? But what we do know is that Jesus's response suggests that the laws and the regulations that they are trying to enforce, there is an intention behind them. There's a purpose behind them that they are missing. That you can get to the place with your understanding of the legal order and the way things are supposed to be, where you miss the whole point of why there are these rules and guidelines given by God. And this comes out in the saying that the Sabbath was made for humankind and not humankind for the Sabbath, suggesting that the Sabbath is originally intended to kind of show compassion and to be this time of healing and rest. And now it's being used to kind of as this gotcha against people. And to be honest, it would seem like, if you think about it, that the people who are going to have trouble keeping a strict Sabbath, like the Pharisees are asking, the people who are going to have trouble are the people who are poor and in need, who are going to have a hard time taking a day off up from their work, or from gathering, if they get some liberty from their toils, to not have to go and do some kind of food production in the midst of that, or people who would have a hard time observing the more drawn out Sabbath regulations of leaving your field fallow for a year and all of that. So there's class dimensions to what's going on here as well, where the people who find it easiest to obey um, the aspects of the law that the Pharisees are highlighting are the ones who find it easy, are the ones who are a position to follow them more easily, who can take the time. It's the kind of the joke, now where we, those of us who are, middle class or somewhat well-to-do, we don't cook on the Sabbath because we go and, make a bunch of people work at a restaurant so that we can relax and eat on the Sabbath without, without exerting ourselves. The same, we don't have to. Anyway, you get the idea that there's this dimension to it where you're taking advantage in some ways of other people and not allowing them to have the same freedoms that you have, all for the sake of observing this law. And I mean, I think Ched Myers in his commentary Binding the Strong Man and other places will really push the ways that Jesus' controversy with the Pharisees really deals with some serious economic issues at the time, and Jesus is pushing for something that is more liberatory toward the oppressed at the time, and against the Pharisees' kind of strict adherence with these laws, even if it means the suffering of those who have less and have less opportunity. And I think, this gets into the the deeper meaning and the more underlying meaning of Sabbath, and the kind of the way that bleeds into the idea of Jubilee, and resting, remission of debts, and all of these things in Say to This Mountain, which is the Ched Myers and other people. He says Jesus' positive Jubilee ethic of Sabbath redistribution is contrasted with the Pharisees' proprietary ethic of Sabbath restrictions. So Jesus it will move throughout the gospel, with an ethic of forgiveness, forgiveness of sins, but also in that the forgiveness of debts, the inclusion in community, the bringing in of those who are exiled because of some impurity or some uncleanness. And then he goes on to say the story endorses the Jubilee notion that hungry people have a right to food despite laws that restrict such access. So we get into I put in the title Breaking Bread and Laws. So there's an aspect to this story of breaking bread together by the eating of the grain, let's say, and then and David eating bread in the story that goes with it. But then also there's the breaking of laws, which is a big focus of this. I see Mark. Mark put a comment in the show. Mark's comment. Yeah, the rest concept. Wow, we could go into that. Yeah, this idea of Sabbath and rest goes back to Genesis 1, the original, the origin of everything, and this idea that after the 6 days of creation, that God rests, and there's two ways to look at that. One is this kind of cessation or stopping of labor and work, and the regulations would say that in this system that they had of slavery and servitude, that everybody gets a rest, the animals get a rest, all creation gets a rest on this Sabbath day. So there's that serious notion of giving people space and time to rest, and ideally time to worship as well. But the other concept of rest, which comes out in the Genesis kind of passage, is from the creator side, is this coming to God. If you think of it as the spirit gliding over the waters, and this image of a bird, almost, and then this idea of coming to rest is also coming to rest, in the sense of looking around, being pleased, and God's presence coming to rest in the garden. And well, anyway, okay, I don't want to go too far afield. And so, yeah, and then Mark is saying, in terms of reflection and appreciation. So I think that maybe is a good way to describe what I was just saying about that, about God's. I didn't leave that up there long enough to be read, but yeah. So I think part of the model that God is showing in that coming to rest on the Sabbath day is this looking out and seeing that everything is very good, and appreciating the cosmos and humanity all wrapped up into one. And this some would say that this the Sabbath being the Sabbath being for humanity, and not humanity for the Sabbath or for man. Some people say that idea, that phrasing harkens back to the Genesis account, and the idea of what rest was instituted for. Yeah, and so, and that leads me to really dive into a little bit about these laws, that the idea of laws, the idea of the intention behind the laws, like the intention behind the Sabbath being this rest, reflection, appreciation of what you have, worship, in the sense of being appreciative of what you have, and the more broader sense of what the laws that the Pharisees are in some ways manipulating, what they were intended to do. And I didn't get a chance to really get into this too much, so I'm going to have to do a kind of a really kind of poor summary of it. But I think there's important parts of it that I want to bring out. And this, we'll see if there's not that many people watching anyway, so if we lose some people, it's okay. But this book here, it's Marx and the Bible: A Critique of the Philosophy of Oppression. Jose Miranda, who trained in Germany, in Frankfurt, and then came back to Mexico. It's a very good book. It's very, it gets a little in the weeds at times, and so for that sense, it's not. It's definitely more like if you got some time in the summer or something to jump into it. But one of the things that he talks about in here is this thing he calls juridical positivism. That, in saying that it's when you advocate that the law itself, it is the law itself which determines what is good or bad. And I think we have this tendency to do this as well. Is we think of what the laws are, and we don't go back to think about how they were instituted, the social context within which they were instituted, their intention, maybe when they were instituted. We just know, hey, we have these laws, and so because we think of ourselves as somewhat good, our laws must be good, you know, and we don't dig any deeper than that. And I think what's happening in this story is is a challenge to just taking laws at face value, taking what even you think might be God given and holy laws, taking them as just given without looking to what their impact is, what their original intention was, you know who who came up with these laws, who was behind it. I mean, this is going to be. I'm afraid. I'm afraid this is going to be clearly laid out in the trial of the officer who murdered George Floyd. I think there is a chance out of everything that's happened that there will be some verdict that will come back, and there's no doubt that he is guilty. That's not in question. It and that he has perpetrated an act of sin and injustice. That is clear. But the question is whether our laws will uh, allow him to get away with it, as has happened so many other times with so many other people who have done something similar. Uh, I mean, and so we have to begin to question. Uh, you know, we have to begin to question these laws, because the law, especially in biblical terms, its intent is justice, and justice in God's terms, and not, you know, some kind of notion of, you know, being able to freely own property, or that, or that sort of thing. So I mean, you can contrast what's going on in that case with, you know, the fight for a union in Alabama. Uh, you know, George Floyd finds himself in the position that he's in, because of this, theoretically, um, or allegedly, he is trying to pass a counterfeit check, you know, um, which is indicative of a situation of of poverty, of a social situation that's putting him in a place where he is, as it says here, that he's trying to he's trying to express his right to have food, right, over against some kind of law that would deny him that food. And then you have Amazon fighting against people being unionized, and what they're trying, the very idea that the law um, is not allowing them, to negotiate and to bargain for the best contract that they can get. We can take this to minimum wage. We can take this to so many places. Um, you know, and that's so. Anyway, I think that's you know, I find this to be especially troubling, because I think in so many different communities, in the Christian community, we we will question we will question a number of things, but um, the goodness and rightness of American law, our Constitution as it stands, is somehow out of bounds, is somehow not within, not something that we can question. Um, but it's so obvious, the voter suppression stuff that's going on in Georgia. Over and over again, we as Christians in particular need to have a way of thinking about our the order and the authorities that structure our world um, as constantly being challenged by Jesus. I mean, I was thinking about it this way. I mean, you have Jesus, who we all claim is the ultimate manifestation of what of who God is and what God desires for the world. The human one, right, embodying the authority and will of God in person, and that we are not prepared to go to the Gospels and check our current order, our current understanding of who has authority and what authority should look like against Jesus, who we claim is the manifestation of God, of what God desires in the world. Um, that that just that's extremely troubling. I think. And Mark, I think you're absolutely right. In your comment about uh, how um, how racism and its impact on communities, doesn't allow for Sabbath to happen. Um, yeah, yeah. I'm going to pull Mark's other comment before I forget about it. Yeah. 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 Right. I think more reflection as preparation for praxis for justice. Yeah. Yeah, and I think I think we have to begin to understand too that our spaces of worship, our spaces of doing the kind of service to the Lord and service to humanity, the loving of our neighbor and of God. That part of what we do inside a church building, right? It's part of what we do on our Sabbath day inside a church building is intended for us as a very intentional community to focus ourselves, to listen deeply to the word of God, to listen to what God is calling us to, and in a very intentional community to try to practice this way of loving and sharing, um, and this practice of justice together, of allowing people space to rest. I mean, I think this is this to Mark's point. This is Mark Davis in the chat, which may be the same as Mark, the gospel writer's point. But to Mark's point, this is why you have the Black church forming, itself is so that because the broader church that was happy to have enslaved Africans as members, as part of its congregation. When emancipation came, there was hostility, and in order to be a community that can listen and worship and practice justice and sharing and love together, the Black church had to be in its own space, that's an indictment on uh, on the rest of the church in many ways, and how we would ever get to a place of truly being willing to practice the repair, the justice, and the love to bring our all of our communities back together, seems like a long way off. Yeah, let me run through a little bit of this book about the concept of law, in the Old Testament and kind of moving forward, and then I'm already at 30 minutes, so let me just hit this real quick. So what? Without making a long story short, in the book, Miranda goes in with this idea of mishpat in the Hebrew word, which kind of like is God's judgments, God's more like God's judgment. And he says that mishpat is the defense of the weak, the liberation of the oppressed, and doing justice to the poor. And he talks about how in Exodus, the earliest versions of the laws, that they were actually called mishpatim. So the judgments or the the right judgments of God. And this goes all the way back. And he says that the moral imperative of justice in which God is revealed might be made inescapable. So what he's saying is that, we find all these reasons for why the laws exist. And what he's saying is that if you go back to the earliest strands, that the reason why they do is because God is trying to make sure that justice is done in the community, and that's where these things come from, and that's how they take the shape that they do. And he says this: the most authentic and primordial theologization, so the theological rationale behind the laws, was made by connecting them with the characteristic essence of the God called Yahweh, as he revealed himself when he broke into human history to save the oppressed from injustice. So saying that when Jesus's ancestors wanted to talk about why they had Sabbath laws, why they had laws about about allowing people to glean from fields, about protecting the poor and the widow and the orphan, when they wanted justification for that, or to tell people the rationale behind it, they went back to the fact that the character of their God, their creator, was one who brought release from oppression, the one that heard their cry and saved them from oppression and from injustice. And he goes on to say, to show that what's at root in this is that the order of society and the authority around that order. It says authority is authority in the measure that it makes us discover the will of God. Authority cannot make something into the will of God, which was not the will of God. So in this story, like we see, is that, these authorities are trying to say that it is the will of God that you do not, satisfy your hunger in this way on this day, and Jesus is saying, no, that the will of God is not going to, the will of God is not going to try to keep certain people hungry and certain people starving because they didn't follow some pattern the right way. I mean, we could write this large on the rationale for why we have starving people in one of the richest nations in the world, right? Because someone will make up some rule for why they're not doing the thing that they should be doing, and so we don't have to worry about them, when in fact, the point is that if we were following God's will, people would be being fed. Our fellow humans would not be starving and not be hungry, and not only in this nation but around the world. And it's not like any of this stuff is a mystery to us about what God desires of us, right? Sure, maybe there's some ways that we have trouble thinking of how to implement certain things, but we know what the intentions of God are. We know what God desires. And again, if we're unclear, we have the witness of Jesus, right? That we could look to and walk with. Um, uh, yeah, I can't go too much. I could, I would go further in this, and there's so much really interesting in here. But one of the things that he talks about in particular is you can see this really clearly about the intention of the law being the doing of justice. The the rescue of the poor, the release of captives, and all the things that Jesus talks about in Luke 4, by the fact that when the prophets come in and criticize, and talk about why why bad things are happening to Israel, why judgment has come against them, their main focus is on issues of justice. It's not necessarily transgression of this law or that law. It's the fact that they are practicing injustice. Let's see. He says, it is not for reasons of non-observance, but for reasons of injustice that Yahweh rejects Israel. And he lists a whole number of examples from Isaiah and Amos and Micah and Zephaniah and Zechariah. And it says, it is clear that for the prophets, the law is important only because of its content of justice. Right. I think that's more than clear. If you look through the Old Testament, and he gets into an interesting argument. I mean, interesting. He moves this forward into talk about the book about Romans and the rest of the New Testament, but I didn't read it well enough to get to get into all of that, but I just wanted to that's just kind of where I wanted to get to with this idea, because I think that I think Mark's impulse is right about, we need more time to reflect and practice this Jesus notion of justice, and then reflect on how that practice went, and then practice again. And I think I got off course when I was talking earlier about the role of the church within the building of, within the churches. Part of what we're meant to do is this intentional community of practice of learning together, to love one another, to practice justice together, to share together, under terms like you are brought up in Mark, in with the feeding of the 5,000, and also in Acts, when you see that people are sharing all their things in common and no one has need. We have this community of worship and of practice and of listening, where we learn to practice that together. That's inside of our walls, but more importantly, that we get out and do our practice of worshiping God and loving our neighbor, out in the streets, out in the world, and use our churches as places to reflect on how that's going. Use any spaces we can find as places to reflect, but also to practice. And yeah, and I mean, Mark talks about worship, but celebration and preparation for action. Yeah, and and I think we have to recognize that that praise and worship and celebration of what God is doing and the Spirit is doing in our midst, is happening all over the place. I think when this summer, when people are out in the street, when they're sensing themselves as this community united around justice. There's people trying to care for one another, medics and everyone on site. The nature of celebration and gratitude for this, for being together, for having, for feeling yourself drawn into um, what God is trying to do in the world, which we can't limit to certain ideas of what we think the label should be or where this should happen, because again, what we're talking about is the practice of justice as God would have it in the world. That's where the followers of Jesus are preparing the way, right? That's where they are making the way for the Lord to come more fully in the world, and that happens. That happens all the time within and outside the walls of our churches. And this is what this is. I mean, this is this is clearly demonstrated in Jesus' life, because in Mark in particular, Jesus doesn't even go to what would be considered their main place of worship until the end of the story, and goes there to fundamentally challenge what's going on there. And his practice in the synagogues is like a direct disruption of the worship that's going on there, because he sees people in need, in the midst of this religious ceremony or whatever's going on, and needs to bring healing, in those spaces, needs to correct injustices, needs to forgive sins, and I mean, so so breaking bread and breaking laws. What I think in the end, what are ways that we can break bread together? I know it's hard in these times in the virus, but what are ways that we can break bread together, that we can walk together, share meals together, share times to edify one another, take in nourishment from one another as we reflect on where we're supposed to be, and practices that we've done and how they're working, and what ways are we called to disrupt the order as it stands, because it is leading to injustice. It is making people's lives miserable. It's not the shalom that God is calling for. Everybody should be able to find that shalom as easily as everyone else, right? That is that's the point. So anyway, thanks for hanging out, and thanks especially to Mark for always keeping things lively over in the chat. I appreciate that very much. And thanks for hanging out. We get to this. We get to chapter 3 next week. Chapter 3, 1-6. So it'll be April. It'll be April. So from December to April, we've made it to chapter 3. Might have to start picking up the pace a little bit, but we'll see. I guess we can go for more than one Christian year. Yeah. Thanks for saying that, Mark, too. Yeah. Happy Easter to everybody. Have a good. Take some time this Holy Week. Just think about the fact that we are. We're moving into this place, especially if you are a Christian and a follower of Jesus. We're moving into this place where our manifestation of who God is in the world directly takes on the order and authority of the day, finds, and to the point where he is executed for sedition, as a an insurrectionist, as a someone who's trying to overthrow the government, basically. So consider that as we move into Holy Week, remember the crucifixion. But then definitely before next Monday, we will move through Easter and remember that love and God's justice prevails in the end. So, all right. Happy Easter, everyone, and blessings and peace to you.